Vincent Barnes had no idea that after weeks away on an exhausting business trip, he would return to find the home he loved so much in a state of abandonment. His body was tired, but his mind was eager to see his kids running towards him, the cozy house filled with memories of happy days. He unlocked the front door and walked in, expecting to hear the sound of small giggles or the familiar pitter-patter of his children's bare feet running around. But what he found was the opposite of what he had dreamed about in his loneliest moments at work. The house was silent, a silence that didn't feel right. Every step he took seemed to echo in a void. He looked around, noticing the absence of nearly everything that made the place a home. The furniture, the pictures, even the toys that used to be scattered across the floor. Everything was gone. The bare walls seemed to tell a story of abandonment and despair. Vincent continued to move forward, his heart racing, suddenly more aware of every detail. He called out for his children, but no answer came. His steps led him to the kitchen, where the shock hit him hard. Reuben, only 8 years old, was lying on the floor with a thin blanket covering him. Next to him, 6-year-old Gary and little Christina, just 3, were also lying down, their faces pale, their small bodies curled up against an invisible cold. They were sleeping soundly, but the atmosphere was far from comfortable. It was an image that screamed misery, abandonment, something he could have never imagined for his family. Instinctively, Vincent knelt beside the children. He touched their foreheads to check if they were sick, but there was no fever. Still, none of it made sense. He looked around, trying to make sense of the scene, his heart pounding in his chest. Where was Catherine? Why were the kids sleeping on the floor with no sign of care? The questions tormented him, but the answers were out of reach. Suddenly, his eyes landed on the kitchen table. Catherine's phone was there, turned off and with a cracked screen. Beside it, a crumpled piece of paper stuck to the fridge caught his attention. With trembling hands, he stood up and walked slowly toward the note. The handwriting was rushed, nearly illegible, but it was unmistakably his wife's. She had left. It wasn't clear where to. The words, though confused, told a story he wasn't ready to face. Catherine had lost her job months ago, and in secret had begun selling the furniture and belongings to try to keep the bare minimum for the kids. The shock hit him like a cold wave. How had he not known? How had she hidden something so serious? He sat at the table, still trying to process everything, but the details that surfaced only dragged him deeper into a disturbing reality. He recalled the last times he had spoken to Catherine. She always said everything was fine, that he didn't need to worry. He believed her. He was busy with work, with trips, and he trusted her. But now, it seemed like everything was a facade. Where was his wife? Why had she left the children like this? Why hadn't she asked for help? He looked again at his children sleeping on the floor and felt the weight of guilt settle on his shoulders. Something was very wrong, and he had barely begun to understand the extent of the problem. Trying to calm his mind, he started to figure out what to do next. He needed to find Catherine, to discover what had happened. He needed to protect his family. He rose from the chair, determined. But before any action, he needed more answers. He had to understand what had happened with his mother, Lisa. Maybe she knew something. However, he vaguely remembered that Lisa was at a health retreat, isolated from the world, recovering from a nervous breakdown that had worsened in recent months. That only left him more frustrated. Vincent was alone in that empty house, with a mystery unraveling before his eyes. All he knew was that his family was in ruins, and he had no idea where to start. Vincent spent hours that night, wide awake, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Catherine's broken phone and the confusing note pinned to the fridge. He had already put the kids to bed, covering them with the only blanket he could find still intact. The emptiness in the house seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. He was still stunned by what he had found when he arrived, but now he needed answers, and he needed to act. He decided to search the house, hoping to find something that could better explain what was going on. When he opened the bedroom closet, there was very little inside. Some of Catherine's clothes were still hanging, but there was no sign that she had packed for a long departure. That bothered him. If Catherine had run away out of fear, it didn't seem like she had prepared for it. Her disappearance was beginning to seem even stranger. As he walked back downstairs, he heard the doorbell ring, an unexpected sound in the quiet of the night. Who could it be? He wasn't expecting anyone, and it was nearly midnight. Cautious, Vincent went to the door and looked through the peephole. On the other side was James Harris, an old friend, someone he hadn't seen in a long time. Surprised, he slowly opened the door. James entered without hesitation, his face serious and his eyes filled with something Vincent couldn't immediately decipher. Without much preamble, James began to speak. "Vincent, I need to tell you something, and it's not easy to hear." Vincent wasn't prepared for what came next. James walked into the house with an expression Vincent hadn't seen in years, a mix of urgency and guilt. This was the same James he had known since childhood, but tonight there was something dark in his friend's eyes. Vincent tried to figure out what was happening before James even spoke, but the exhaustion and confusion clouded his mind. The silence in the house, broken only by James's uneven breathing, made everything feel even more surreal. "What's going on, James?" Vincent asked, his voice hoarse and low, as if he was afraid of the answer. James looked around, his eyes scanning the empty room, the few remaining pieces of furniture, the marks of a life that was crumbling. He didn't need to ask what was happening. It was clear that things were bad, maybe much worse than he had imagined. "Vincent, it's about your brother Thomas," James began bluntly, his voice heavy with concern. "He's gotten himself into something much worse than we could have imagined." Vincent closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. Thomas had always been trouble. He had tried to help him many times, but his younger brother always fell back into the same traps. Debts, addictions, broken promises. But as frustrating as Thomas was, he never thought his brother could be the root of the chaos now falling on his family. What did he do this time? Vincent muttered, feeling nausea rise in his stomach. James took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the right words. "It's not simple, Vincent. Thomas got involved with some dangerous people, very dangerous. He's been in debt for a long time, but this time it's different. He made a deal with a man named Isaiah, a distant cousin of yours, but this guy, he's not just a loan shark, he's connected to the underworld with things you don't want to get mixed up in." Vincent's stomach twisted. He barely knew Isaiah, had only heard vague mentions of his existence, but he never imagined he could be involved in something like this. His body tensed, heart racing as he tried to absorb what James was revealing. "What does this have to do with Catherine?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. James hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything. "Catherine got involved when Thomas started getting desperate," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "He went to her for money. At first, she didn't want to get him involved, but he convinced her that it was a temporary situation, that he just needed help until he could get back on his feet. But Thomas kept asking for more. He manipulated her, saying it was to protect you all, to keep you safe from the men he was involved with." Vincent was in shock. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His wife, the woman he trusted completely, had hidden something so serious from him. He felt betrayed, but at the same time, he knew Catherine wouldn't do something like this unless she was terrified. And now the pieces were starting to fall into place, the loss of her job, the sale of the furniture, the abandonment of the house. So, she was forced into this, into hiding everything from me? Vincent asked, his throat tightening, his voice breaking. James nodded, his expression filled with regret. "She was being threatened, Vincent. Isaiah and his men wanted money, much more than she could offer. Thomas kept sinking deeper into debt, and Catherine tried to protect your kids the only way she knew how. She hid them, hoping you'd come back, trying to buy time until she could figure out a solution. But now, I don't know where she is, and I'm afraid she's in trouble." Vincent shot up from his chair abruptly, feeling an uncontrollable rage bubbling inside him. He wanted to blame Thomas for everything. He wanted to blame him for putting his wife and kids in this desperate situation. But more than anything, he felt a growing panic. Catherine was missing, and now he knew she was involved in something far more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. "I need to find her," he said, his voice firm. "No matter what's happened, no matter what she's done." Catherine was trying to protect our family, and now I have to do the same." James nodded, but before he could say anything, Vincent's phone started vibrating on the table. It was a message. He grabbed it quickly, heart racing, hoping it was a clue about Catherine. But the message was from an unknown number, one he didn't recognize. "If you want to see your wife again, don't try to act alone. You know who we are, and you know what we're capable of. Isaias." Vincent felt the world freeze around him. The words were direct and threatening, and the implication was clear. Catherine was in Isaias's hands. Panic turned into pure rage. But above all, he knew he needed help. He couldn't do this alone. He looked at James, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation before Vincent even said a word. James knew the streets, understood how the underworld worked. But more importantly, Vincent knew they needed someone who understood the legal side of things. Someone like Percy Boschman, the old cop friend. "We're gonna fix this, Vincent," James said firmly. "But we need to be smart. We can't make any wrong moves. Percy can help. He has connections. He can set something up to take down Thomas and Isaias once and for all." Vincent nodded, his mind racing. They needed a plan, one that wouldn't put Catherine and the kids in more danger, and they needed to act fast. But all the while, the shadow of Thomas loomed over everything. The brother he once swore to protect was now part of the chaos threatening to destroy his family. The next few hours dragged on in a whirlwind of dark thoughts and tough decisions. Vincent's phone sat on the table like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode. Isaias's message, with its veiled threat, had carved fear deep into his chest, but Vincent knew he couldn't act impulsively. Every move had to be calculated. The silence of the house, once so unsettling, now seemed like a prelude to something far bigger, something he was only beginning to comprehend. James watched Vincent in silence, as if waiting for the right moment to act. His face showed deep concern, but also the urgency of someone who knew that time was a relentless enemy. Without wasting another minute, Vincent grabbed the phone and dialed Percy Boschman. Percy was a longtime friend, someone Vincent knew he could trust without question. He was a respected cop, but more than that, he knew the dark side of the city, the dangerous figures who operated in the shadows. If anyone could help, it was Percy. Vincent put the phone on speaker, and Percy's steady voice answered on the other end. "Boschman." "Percy, it's me, Vincent," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need your help. It's urgent." There was a brief pause. Vincent knew Percy wasn't a man who asked unnecessary questions, and soon the response came, firm as always. "What's going on, Vincent?" Vincent explained everything, holding nothing back. Catherine's disappearance, Isaias's threats, Thomas's involvement. As he spoke, the tension in the room grew thicker. James stood beside him, listening intently, while Percy remained silent on the other end. When Vincent finished recounting the events, Percy spoke with a somber clarity. "This is serious, Vincent. We're dealing with organized criminals. If you've already received a threat, it's because they know you'll react. We need to be careful. But listen, I can't put together something official without compromising everything. We'll have to operate off the books." Vincent felt a knot in his throat. It was clear Percy was willing to help, but the implications were frightening. Acting outside the law meant playing by the same rules as Isaias and his men. It meant there would be risks, deadly ones maybe. "Do you know where Thomas is?" Percy asked. Vincent hesitated for a moment before answering. "No, but James can help track him down. He has contacts." James, who had been quiet until then, nodded. "I know some people who have information about his whereabouts. I can make a few calls." Percy sighed over the phone, as if already bracing for the chaos that was about to unfold. "All right, here's the plan. I'll bring in a few trusted people. We can't involve too many. If they realize we're coming, they'll disappear with Catherine, and then—" Percy didn't finish the sentence, but the silence that followed spoke louder than words. Vincent knew what it meant. There was no room for mistakes. "We'll meet tomorrow," Percy continued. "Somewhere discreet. Don't do anything until then. And please, stay safe." After ending the call, Vincent and James sat in silence for a moment. The weight of the situation seemed to press down on them. Percy's plan was clear. Operate in the shadows, away from the law's gaze, and with as little information leaking to their enemies as possible. But Vincent knew that before the meeting with Percy, he and James needed to find Thomas. His brother was at the center of all of this, and finding him would be the first step to saving Catherine. James stood up, looking determined. "I'll make some calls," he said. "Let me see what I can dig up about Thomas and Isaiah. These guys always leave a trail. If I can find them, Percy will have the advantage he needs." Vincent nodded, though his heart felt heavy. Every passing minute was torture. Catherine was out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly terrified, and he couldn't do anything until they had more information. The helplessness was eating him alive, but he knew acting without a plan was exactly what the enemies wanted. James left the house to make his calls, leaving Vincent alone with his thoughts. He looked around at the empty walls, the lifeless rooms. The house that had once been a refuge for him and his family now felt like a mausoleum of secrets and lies. Thoughts of Thomas began flooding his mind. How had things gotten to this point? How had his younger brother, the boy he had once protected, fallen so far? Memories of simpler times, when Thomas was just a troubled kid, resurfaced, but now they were tainted by the harsh reality. After hours of anxious waiting, James returned with some information. "I found something," he said, his expression tense. "Thomas is hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He's holed up there with some of Isaiah's men. Apparently, things aren't going well between them. Thomas is trying to get out of the situation, but he's afraid Isaiah will kill him if he does." Vincent felt a spark of hope and anger at the same time. Thomas was hiding, which meant he wasn't completely lost yet. Maybe there was still time to save his brother. Maybe he could fix things. "We need to tell Percy," Vincent said, but before he could grab the phone, James stopped him. "Wait, I think there's more. My contact said Isaiah is planning something big. He wants Thomas to pull off one last job for him, something that's going to bring in a lot of money. And if Thomas fails, Catherine is going to pay the price." Vincent's blood ran cold. Isaiah wasn't just threatening his family. He was using his wife as leverage to ensure Thomas did his bidding. And now, time was running out even faster. "What do we do?" Vincent asked, trying to keep his voice steady. James took a deep breath before answering. "We'll meet Percy tomorrow and figure out the next steps. But Vincent, you need to be prepared for the worst. Thomas is at a breaking point. He might be the key to saving Catherine, but he could also be the reason everything falls apart." Vincent didn't need further explanation. The brother he had once sworn to protect was now dragging his entire family into an abyss. But no matter how hard it was, he knew he had to save Catherine first. And to do that, he would have to face the ghosts of his past and confront head-on what Thomas had become. The next step would be crucial. Vincent spent the night wide awake. Sitting in the empty living room, he watched the shadows crawl across the walls, as if reflecting the dark thoughts dominating his mind. The revelations about Thomas, Isaiah, and Catherine's involvement swirled in his head, blurring his sense of time. Every second felt slow and painful. He couldn't stop imagining Catherine being held captive, scared, maybe even hurt. The anxiety ate away at him, and the urge to act on his own kept growing. But he knew any misstep could cost her life. The sound of small footsteps on the stairs interrupted his thoughts. Reuben, his 8-year-old son, appeared at the entrance of the room, his eyes still puffy with sleep, but his expression carried a wisdom Vincent wasn't expecting to see so soon. "Dad?" Reuben murmured, his voice soft and hesitant. Vincent forced a smile, which felt impossible given the situation. He walked over to his son and knelt in front of him, trying not to show the overwhelming anguish inside him. "What's going on? Where's Mom?" Reuben asked, with the unsettling sincerity of a child who already knew something was terribly wrong. Vincent took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. He couldn't lie, but he also couldn't give all the details. The last thing he wanted was for his kids to be dragged deeper into this nightmare. "Mom, she's taking care of some important things," he began, carefully choosing his words. "I promise she'll be back, and I'm handling everything. You guys are safe, I guarantee it." Reuben nodded, but his eyes said he wasn't convinced. There was something heartbreaking in that exchange. Vincent realized his children had already been scarred by their mother's absence, by the lack of explanations, and in some way, he knew those scars would remain forever. "Go back to bed, son," Vincent said gently. "Everything's going to be okay." Reuben hesitated for a moment, but then climbed back up the stairs, his head still low. Vincent watched him disappear down the hall before standing up and sighing, feeling the crushing weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had to get Catherine out of this situation, not just for her, but for Reuben, Gary, and Christina. The future of his family depended on every decision he would make in the coming hours. When the clock struck dawn, Vincent and James headed to the meeting point they had arranged with Percy. The chosen spot was an abandoned auto shop on the outskirts of town, a discreet place far from prying eyes. James drove in silence, while Vincent remained lost in thought, replaying every detail of the conversation from the night before. His mind kept circling back to Isaiah's threatening message and Thomas's desperate situation. When they arrived, Percy was already waiting, standing with two men who appeared to be trustworthy. He waved them over discreetly. The atmosphere was one of absolute seriousness, and there was no time for pleasantries. "What do you have?" Percy asked as they stepped out of the car. Vincent relayed the information James had gathered the night before. Thomas was hiding in a warehouse, and Isaiah was pressuring him to pull off one last job, something big and dangerous. Catherine, as they had learned, was Isaiah's guarantee that Thomas wouldn't fail. Percy listened in silence, his face expressionless, like a strategist studying every move on an invisible chessboard. "We have two options," he began, his voice grave. "The first is to follow Thomas and wait for him to lead us directly to Isaiah and Catherine. If we catch him at the right moment, we could use him for a trade or negotiation. The second option is riskier. We go straight to the warehouse and attempt a quick strike. But if Isaiah is there and senses anything's off, Catherine could be in immediate danger." Vincent felt his throat tighten. Neither option was safe, but he knew he had to act. Time was against them, and every second meant more risk for Catherine. "Do we have any idea when this last job is supposed to happen?" Vincent asked. Percy nodded slowly. "From the intel James gathered, it's happening soon. Thomas is under pressure, so they're likely to move in the next few days. Maybe even today. If we wait too long, we might lose our chance." Vincent was overwhelmed with anxiety. Every choice felt like a shot in the dark, but somehow he had to trust Percy and James. They were his only hope. "Then we go after Thomas," Vincent decided, his voice filled with determination. "If we can catch him before he makes a move, maybe we can still save Catherine before it's too late." Percy nodded, seeming to agree with the decision. "We'll move fast. We need to catch him off guard before he has a chance to escape." Percy's men began preparing, checking their weapons and equipment. James, meanwhile, made a few calls, trying to confirm Thomas's exact location. Vincent watched everything with a mixture of anxiety and resignation. The pieces were moving, but the outcome was uncertain. The tension mounted as they approached the warehouse. It was an isolated area, far from the main streets, surrounded by overgrown vegetation and rusted structures. Vincent, James, Percy, and the others spread out, using the darkness and silence as their allies. Vincent's heart pounded in his chest, so hard it almost suffocated him. He didn't know what he would find inside that warehouse, but he was willing to face anything. He had to save Catherine. He had to understand what had driven his life into this chaos. "There he is," James whispered, pointing discreetly to the figure of Thomas standing by a side door of the warehouse, smoking a cigarette, his face dark, filled with fear and paranoia. He appeared to be alone, but Vincent knew that at any moment, everything could change. Percy signaled for everyone to get into position. The plan was simple: intercept Thomas before he could alert Isaiah or anyone else. They needed him alive and cooperating. But Vincent knew that this confrontation would be anything but easy. The moment of reckoning was drawing closer, and deep down, Vincent knew that the brother he would find there was no longer the boy he had once promised to protect. Vincent watched Thomas from a distance, his heart pounding violently in his chest. The man standing before him, hunched and jittery, no longer resembled his brother. Thomas's features were etched with fear, the paranoia of someone who knew his time was running out. He kept glancing around, as if expecting someone to come after him at any moment. Percy gave a discreet signal to his men. They positioned themselves strategically, ready to intercept Thomas without drawing attention. Vincent knew this moment was critical. If Thomas realized he was surrounded, he might try to run, or worse, alert Isaiah. But something inside Vincent held him back from acting coldly. Despite all the anger and disappointment he felt, it was still his brother standing there. The boy he had protected as a child, who had always needed help. But now Vincent understood Thomas wasn't just in trouble, he was part of the trouble. Seeing the hesitation in Vincent's eyes, Percy stepped closer and murmured, without taking his eyes off Thomas, "We need to act, Vincent. Now's the time." Vincent nodded, but his feet felt glued to the ground. He knew that once they moved, there would be no turning back. But he had to remember why he was here. Catherine was missing, his family was falling apart, and Thomas played a central role in all of it. He took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage he needed. Before Percy could give the signal, Vincent took the initiative. He stepped out of the shadows, walking toward Thomas with determined steps. Percy tried to stop him with a gesture, but Vincent was beyond reason. Emotion had taken over. "Thomas!" Vincent's voice echoed through the empty space, firm but filled with pain. Thomas jumped in shock, dropping his cigarette to the ground and spinning around quickly. The panic in his eyes was clear. He knew he was being hunted, but he hadn't expected to see his brother standing so close. For a moment, Thomas's expression wavered between fear and shame. He opened his mouth but couldn't form words. Everything seemed to be crumbling around him. "What have you done, Thomas?" Vincent continued, approaching, never taking his eyes off his brother. "Where's Catherine?" Thomas took a step back, his eyes locked on Vincent's, like a cornered animal. He tried to speak, but the words came out fragmented, incoherent. "Vincent, I didn't have a choice," Thomas mumbled, his voice trembling. "It's not what you think. They forced me. Isaiah, he threatened me." Vincent stopped, the anger starting to overtake his emotions. He took another step forward, his gaze piercing through the excuses Thomas was trying to hide behind. "You put my wife and kids in danger, Thomas," he shouted, unable to contain the fury he had been suppressing for so long. "How could you do this? How could you let it come to this?" Thomas tried to defend himself, but his voice faltered with every attempt. He was trapped, not just physically, but emotionally. He knew there was no excuse that could undo what he had done. "I didn't want to." Thomas stammered, tears beginning to fill his eyes. "Vincent, I just wanted out. I thought if I could get the money, everything would be okay. But they control me. Isaiah controls me." Vincent felt the anger fade for a moment, replaced by deep sadness. He saw the desperation in his brother, the same desperation he had seen so many times when Thomas found himself in difficult situations. But this time was different. This time, the stakes were much higher. It wasn't just about money, but about the safety and lives of his family. Before Vincent could respond, Percy and his men moved in, subtly but effectively surrounding Thomas. The tension in the air was thick. "We don't have much time," Percy said in a low, direct tone. "Where's Isaiah, and what is he planning?" Thomas looked around, realizing he was completely surrounded. He knew there was nowhere to run. His breathing quickened and his words came out in a rush. "Isaiah is waiting for me. He gave me one last chance. He wants me to pull a job for him tonight, something big. If I do it, he said he'll let me go. And, Catherine, he's keeping her as leverage." Vincent's stomach turned. It was as he feared. Isaiah was using Catherine as a bargaining chip, and now he knew time was running out. "Where is she?" Vincent asked, his voice lower but filled with tension. Thomas hesitated, his eyes dropping to the ground. He seemed to be fighting an internal battle, unsure whether to trust Vincent or continue following Isaiah's orders. "She's in a warehouse nearby," Thomas finally whispered. "Isaiah has her there with some of his men. He said if I fail or try to run, he'll kill her." Those words hit Vincent like a punch to the gut. The horror of the situation became more real by the second. But at the same time, he knew he had an advantage. Thomas was willing to help. Even if it was out of fear, Vincent knew his brother wouldn't let Catherine die. Not now. Percy looked at Vincent and then at Thomas, assessing the situation. "We need to move quickly," Percy said, his voice filled with authority. "Thomas, you're going to lead us to that warehouse. If Isaiah suspects anything, you'll be the first to go down. Understand?" Thomas nodded frantically, his face pale with fear. As the plan started to take shape, Vincent felt the weight of the coming hours pressing down on him with brutal force. He was about to confront not only Isaiah, but the chaos Thomas had brought into their lives. Desperation gnawed at him, but he couldn't let it paralyze him. Catherine was out there, held captive by a dangerous man, and she was depending on him to save her. With Thomas leading the way, they headed toward the warehouse. Night had fallen over the city, and the darkness seemed to close in around them, intensifying the sense of urgency. Every step brought Vincent closer to the final confrontation, closer to discovering whether he would still have a family intact at the end of this nightmare. The air around the warehouse was thick, heavy with tension and danger. Thomas led Vincent, Percy, and the others to the side entrance, where shadows moved discreetly, revealing Isaiah's men. The warehouse was old, its walls corroded by time, and the gates were rusted. Inside, Catherine was being held. Vincent's heart pounded as if it might explode, his hands trembling slightly. "We have to move fast," Percy murmured as he scanned the area. "One mistake, and this could end very badly." Thomas nodded, fear clearly visible on his face. He knew both Catherine's and his own lives were at stake. One wrong move, one act of betrayal, and everything could collapse. Vincent felt the weight of the moment as he followed Thomas toward the warehouse. Each step echoed the growing tension, the air around them seeming to thicken with every meter they crossed. The warehouse, now visible in the distance, was an old structure, surrounded by overgrown vegetation and rusted walls. The dim, flickering lights around the place barely illuminated the darkness, but Vincent knew that behind those walls, Catherine was waiting, and time was running out. Percy remained vigilant, checking every angle and studying the terrain. He was an experienced man, and Vincent trusted him to lead the operation. But right now, it was his emotion guiding his movements. His heart raced uncontrollably, his body on high alert. Next to him, James stayed silent, focused. He knew that any misstep could be fatal. "Thomas, it's now or never," Percy whispered firmly. "Lead us to the spot. If Isaiah suspects anything, you know what could happen." Thomas, pale and sweating, nodded silently. He was caught between two worlds. On one side, a fractured loyalty to those who controlled him. On the other, the fear of losing his brother and seeing everything fall apart. He began to walk faster, and Vincent and the others followed. The side entrance to the warehouse was lightly guarded, but there were two men, both armed, chatting casually. Thomas waved to them from a distance, trying to appear calm. One of the men, taller and with a scar running across his face, eyed him suspiciously, as if sensing something was off. "Who are they?" the man with the scar asked, stepping forward. His hand slowly moved toward the gun holstered at his waist. Thomas stammered for a second, searching for the right words. "They're with me. Isaiah said I could bring help for tonight's job," he replied without much conviction. The man narrowed his eyes, clearly distrustful, but shrugged. "If Isaiah said so, then fine," he responded, though his eyes never left Vincent and Percy, who maintained a neutral stance, trying not to draw attention. Percy gave a slight nod to Vincent. The signal was clear. They needed to get inside and act fast. Any hesitation could cost them dearly. As they entered the warehouse, the smell of rust and oil enveloped them. The atmosphere was claustrophobic, with old machinery piled up, casting shifting shadows on the walls. The sound of muffled voices came from the back, and Vincent could feel he was getting closer to Catherine. His body was on high alert, every muscle tense as his eyes scanned the area for any sign of her. Thomas suddenly stopped, and Vincent almost ran into him. Thomas looked back, nervous. "She's in there in the back room," he whispered, pointing to a metal door half hidden behind some rusted containers. "Isaiah has 2 more men with him. We need to move fast." Percy nodded and signaled for his men to take their positions. Every move had to be precise. The plan was simple: get in, neutralize Isaiah's men, and get Catherine out before anything went wrong. Vincent mentally prepared himself, knowing there was no turning back. Every second that passed could be Catherine's last. "Let's go," Percy murmured. They moved silently, circling the containers until they reached the metal door. Adrenaline surged through Vincent's body. He could hear whispers coming from the other side of the door. He was so close to Catherine he felt like he could reach out and touch her, but he knew danger was waiting. Percy gave one final signal, and two of his trusted men moved forward, ready to breach. Vincent took a deep breath, bracing himself for the confrontation. Then, suddenly, the metal door swung open violently. On the other side, Isaiah appeared, a cold smile on his lips and a gun pointed directly at Vincent. Time seemed to stop. The silence in the air was deadly. Isaiah looked at Vincent, then at Thomas, who froze in place, completely paralyzed. "I expected this," Isaiah said calmly, though his voice dripped with venom. "I knew you would betray me, Thomas, but bringing your brother and a cop, that's low, even for you." Thomas took a step back, visibly terrified. "I didn't have a choice," he murmured, his voice faltering. Isaiah looked at Thomas with absolute disdain, as if he were less than nothing. "There's always a choice," Isaiah said, before turning the gun toward Thomas. In that moment, chaos erupted. Percy reacted first, pulling out his gun and firing at one of Isaiah's men who had approached from the side. The shot echoed through the warehouse, shattering the silence. Vincent instinctively lunged forward, charging toward Isaiah. The sound of gunfire and shouts filled the air as Percy and his men exchanged fire with Isaiah's crew. Vincent wasn't thinking, just acting. All that mattered in that moment was getting to Catherine. Isaiah, caught off guard by Vincent's speed, tried to aim at him, but Vincent was already on him, slamming him against the wall with force. Isaiah's gun clattered to the floor, sliding out of reach. "Where's Catherine?" Vincent yelled, grabbing Isaiah by the collar. Isaiah, gasping for air, sneered despite being pinned against the wall. "She's here, but will you get to her in time?" he taunted before spitting in Vincent's face. Consumed with rage, Vincent shoved him aside. He knew he didn't have time to waste on Isaiah. He needed to find Catherine. As gunfire continued to echo through the warehouse, Vincent sprinted toward the back room. He burst through the door, and there in the corner, tied up and with panic in her eyes, was Catherine. She looked worn, with bruises on her face and wrists, but she was alive. "Catherine!" Vincent rushed to her, his hands trembling as he untied the ropes. Catherine looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Vincent, I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered, her voice broken with relief and pain. Vincent pulled her into a tight embrace, unable to hold back the tears that filled his eyes. He said, his voice choked with emotion, "And I'm never letting this happen again." But before they could leave the room, a final gunshot rang out through the warehouse. Vincent's body froze as the sound of the shot reverberated in his mind. He turned slowly, only to see Thomas lying on the ground, his hand pressed to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. The horror of the scene hit him like a blow. Isaiah, who had briefly broken free, was now pinned to the ground by Percy's men. But the damage had been done. Thomas had been shot. "Thomas!" Vincent yelled, rushing to his brother's side. He knelt beside Thomas, who was struggling to breathe. Blood pooled around him, and Vincent pressed his hands to the wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. Thomas's eyes met Vincent's, filled with regret and pain. I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, his voice weak. I just wanted to fix things." Vincent gripped his brother's hand tightly, tears streaming down his face. "Stay with me, Thomas. We're getting you out of here. You're going to make it," Vincent said, even though he knew the words were futile. The wound was too severe. Thomas gave a faint smile, his eyes slowly closing. "Take care of the family, Vincent, for me." And with those final words, Thomas took his last breath. Vincent felt the world collapse around him. He had saved Catherine, but he lost his brother in the same moment. The mixture of relief and grief was overwhelming. Percy approached, placing a hand on Vincent's shoulder, but said nothing. He knew there were no words for this moment. The battle was over, but Vincent's internal war was just beginning. Vincent knelt beside Thomas's body, time seeming to have stopped. His hands still pressed against his brother's chest, as if somehow that could bring him back. But Thomas's eyes were closed, his chest no longer rose, and the warmth of his life faded with each passing second. The sounds around Vincent became muffled, distant. The voices of Percy's men, the echoes of gunfire still lingering in his mind, all were silenced by the brutal reality he now faced. He had failed his brother. No matter what Thomas had done, he was still Vincent's responsibility. He had promised to protect him when they were children, and now the weight of that broken promise crushed him like an avalanche. Catherine, still fragile and marked by the trauma of her capture, approached slowly. Her eyes were red, exhaustion and the strain of the ordeal clearly visible in her face. But when she saw Vincent there beside Thomas, she knew this was more than just a victory over Isaiah. There was a wound here that would never fully heal. She knelt beside Vincent, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. At first, he didn't react, but slowly, Vincent lifted his head. The determination in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a hollow emptiness consumed by pain. He looked at Catherine, and the words formed slowly in his mind, though he knew none of them could truly express what he felt. I failed him, Catherine," Vincent murmured, his voice low, as if speaking more to himself than to her. He was always lost, and I didn't help him. I should have done more." Catherine moved closer, wrapping her arms around Vincent and resting her head on his shoulder. There were no words that could heal this wound, but her presence offered a quiet comfort. She, too, knew the weight of carrying secrets and the devastating consequences they could bring. Both of them now understood just how much it had cost them. "You did what you could, Vincent," Catherine said, her voice strained with emotion. "He made his choices, but you never gave up on him. You brought him this far." Vincent wanted to believe that, but the guilt was too heavy to carry. He remembered all the times Thomas had asked for help, all the times he had ignored or underestimated the signs that his brother was spiraling into an abyss. Now the truth was laid bare before him. Thomas had been lost, and Vincent couldn't save him. Percy approached, his expression serious and somber. He observed the scene with respect, but knew they couldn't stay there much longer. Isaiah was in custody, and his men had either been captured or killed in the firefight. Still, the situation was delicate, and Percy knew they needed to leave before more trouble arrived. "Vincent," Percy began, his voice careful. "We need to go. The police will be here soon, and it's better if you're not here when that happens. I'll handle everything." Vincent, still in shock, nodded slowly. He looked one last time at Thomas, the brother who had never found peace. Catherine helped Vincent to his feet, and he wiped his face, still dazed by the intensity of the loss. Her hands gripped his firmly, trying to offer him some stability amidst the chaos that surrounded them. "Let's go," Catherine said, her voice soft but steady. They began to walk away slowly, leaving Thomas's body behind. Vincent felt a confusing mix of emotions: deep sadness, crushing guilt, and a quiet, simmering anger at fate. He had saved Catherine, but at what cost? The answer was clear: the price had been his brother's life. As they walked away, James, who had remained silent during the entire confrontation, approached Vincent. "I'm sorry, man," James said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "Thomas made some bad choices, but you did the best you could. Not everything was in your control." Vincent looked at James and gave a slight nod, but he couldn't respond. James's words, though well-meaning, didn't ease the weight he carried. Vincent knew it would take a long time, if it ever happened at all, for him to forgive himself for not doing more for Thomas. As they walked out of the warehouse, Vincent glanced in Isaiah's direction. The man, now handcuffed and under Percy's control, still wore a cold smile despite his defeat. There was something disturbing in that look, something that suggested he didn't see this as a definitive loss. But Vincent didn't let it intimidate him. Isaiah had lost, and his grip over Thomas and Catherine had been broken. As they stepped outside, the sharp wind of the early morning hit them. The city seemed quiet, as if the chaos of the warehouse had been a nightmare confined to that space. Vincent and Catherine walked to the car, where they sat in silence for a long time, trying to process everything that had happened. Catherine held Vincent's hand tightly, and he felt the warmth of her touch grounding him back to reality. "We'll get through this," Catherine said, her voice soft but filled with the determination Vincent had always admired in her. "Together, we'll get through it." Vincent looked at her, and for a moment, something flickered inside him. It wasn't optimism. Catherine was here. They had lost so much, but they still had each other. Maybe it was possible to rebuild. Maybe, with time, the wounds would begin to heal. The days following Catherine's rescue and Thomas's death were long and quiet. Vincent felt his brother's absence like an open wound. Even knowing Thomas had made disastrous choices, the guilt consumed him. Every time he looked at his children, Reuben, Gary, and little Christina, He wondered if he could have prevented all of this. Could he have protected his family better and somehow saved Thomas too? Catherine, still shaken, spent her days in silence, trying to recover from the trauma. Though she was back home, the shadow of the danger she had faced still lingered over her. Sometimes, Vincent would catch her looking at their children with tears in her eyes, as if she still couldn't believe she was safe. The children, especially Reuben, sensed that something had changed. Thomas's absence, his unspoken death, was a heavy secret that Vincent didn't yet know how to explain. Reuben was old enough to sense that something tragic had happened, but still too young to grasp the full complexity of that loss. Vincent had promised himself that, when the time was right, he would explain the truth to his children. But for now, silence was the only answer. James, who visited Vincent regularly, tried to help his friend process the grief. He had known Vincent since they were young and understood how important the bond between him and Thomas had been, even in the hardest moments. But there was a pain that James couldn't heal, a guilt that Vincent had to face on his own. Percy, true to his word, took care of everything regarding Isaias and his men. Isaias now faced multiple criminal charges, and his underground connections were slowly being dismantled. However, none of this seemed enough to ease Vincent's pain. Even with Isaias out of the picture, the void Thomas left behind was too deep. One afternoon, a few weeks after the events at the warehouse, Vincent received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, but something about the envelope made him shudder. He carefully opened it to find a single sheet of paper with only a few handwritten words. "You saved Catherine, but this isn't over. What was lost will never be forgotten." It was signed by Isaias. Vincent felt his heart race. Even behind bars, Isaias still found a way to haunt them. Isaias's letter felt like a punch to Vincent's gut. Though Isaias was in prison, he still managed to exert his power, even from a distance. Vincent knew the letter wasn't a direct threat, but a reminder that the consequences of what had happened with Thomas and their family wouldn't be easily forgotten. Isaias, even in defeat, had planted seeds of fear and doubt, and now those seeds were starting to grow in Vincent's mind. Catherine noticed the immediate impact the letter had on her husband. Seeing him frozen in front of it, his face pale and hands trembling, she slowly approached. Gently, she took the piece of paper from his hands and read the few words, brief but carrying a terrifying weight. "He's still trying to control us," Catherine said, her voice steady but exhausted. "Even from prison, he wants us to live in fear." Vincent looked at her, feeling frustration and helplessness boil up inside him. He had spent weeks trying to move past Thomas's death, trying to rebuild his life alongside Catherine and their children. But now, it seemed Isaias was determined to destroy the small piece of peace they had worked so hard to find. "We can't let this control us," Catherine said, gripping Vincent's hand tightly. "He wants us to keep suffering, to live in fear, but we won't. We can't." Her words were full of strength, but Vincent knew that behind them there was a lingering fear. Catherine was still struggling to recover from everything she had gone through, and now Isaias continued to torment them. Vincent took a deep breath, trying to push away the growing dread he felt. He needed to protect his family. He needed to be strong for them. "I'll talk to Percy," he said, trying to sound resolute. "He needs to know about this. I'm not letting Isaias intimidate us again." Catherine nodded, but her expression remained worried. She knew Vincent was exhausted. He carried not only the burden of responsibility for the family, but also the guilt over Thomas's death. And now, with Isaias still casting shadows over their lives, the fight was far from over. The next day, Vincent met with Percy. They chose a discreet cafe, far from curious eyes. Vincent brought Isaias's letter, knowing Percy needed to see it to grasp the seriousness of the situation. When Percy read the words, his face hardened. "This guy isn't going to give up easily, even behind bars," Percy said, handing the letter back to Vincent. "Isaias has connections, and if he says it's not over, we need to take that seriously." Vincent nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew Isaias was dangerous, but the thought that his influence still reached beyond the prison walls was deeply unsettling. "What can we do?" Vincent asked, frustration evident in his voice. Percy thought for a moment, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. We need to make sure he stays locked up and cut off from the outside world. I'll see what I can do to sever any communication he has with the outside, but it won't be easy. Guys like him always find ways to get through. I'll need some time." Vincent knew Percy was doing everything he could, but the fear had already taken root. He wasn't just worried about Isaiah's threats, but what they meant for his family. Would they ever truly be safe? Before the conversation could continue, Percy's phone rang. He answered quickly, and Vincent noticed Percy's expression change as he listened. When he hung up, he looked at Vincent with a look of absolute seriousness. "Vincent, there's something you need to know," Percy said, tension evident in his voice. "We've received confidential information about Thomas. It seems he was involved in something much bigger than we thought. Isaiah wasn't just using Thomas for small jobs or debts. He was part of a money laundering scheme that involved powerful figures, people above Isaiah. Thomas knew too much, and it looks like someone was willing to get rid of him." Vincent was in shock. Thomas's death hadn't just been the result of a bad decision or a confrontation at the warehouse. There was something much bigger at play, something Vincent couldn't fully grasp yet. "You're saying Thomas was killed because he knew too much?" Vincent asked, feeling the weight of the words hit him. Percy nodded slowly. "It's possible. Isaiah was using your brother as a pawn in a much larger game. And now that Thomas is dead, some of these people might be worried about what he could have left behind. We need to find out what else Thomas knew, and if he left anything that could implicate others." A chill ran down Vincent's spine. He had no idea Thomas was so deeply involved in something so dangerous. His brother's death, already painful, now seemed entangled in secrets that could put more lives at risk. "Did Thomas have anything? Any clues?" Vincent asked, desperate for answers. "We don't know yet," Percy replied, "but we're going to find out. We need to move fast. If he left any trail, other people will be looking for it too. And if they find something before we do, it could be dangerous for you and your family." Vincent realized this situation was far from over. Thomas's death had been the beginning of a new mystery, a web of dark secrets that now threatened everyone around him. He stood up, feeling the weight of this new revelation. Percy placed a hand on his shoulder. "I won't let anything happen to your family, Vincent. I promise. But we need to be cautious from here on out. We have to figure out what Thomas knew, and fast." Vincent nodded, his face tense. He wasn't just dealing with the grief of losing his brother. Now there was a hidden truth, something Thomas had taken to the grave. And as long as that secret remained buried, the danger would continue to loom over them. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and constant vigilance. Vincent couldn't stop thinking about what Percy had revealed. The idea that Thomas had been involved in something so complex, and that his death might have been orchestrated by forces beyond Isaiah, was hard to accept. But at the same time, it made sense. Thomas had always been trying to escape his debts and problems, and perhaps in that desperation, he had gotten involved in something far bigger than he could handle. While Percy and his team conducted their investigation, Vincent and Catherine tried to move forward. Yet, Isaiah's letter and the looming shadow of whatever Thomas might have left behind haunted them every day. One afternoon, as Vincent searched through Thomas's belongings, hoping to find anything that might indicate what his brother knew, he stumbled upon a small metal box hidden at the back of a closet. It was an old, worn box with a tiny lock. Vincent's heart raced. He knew this might hold the answers he'd been seeking. Carefully, he broke the lock and opened the box. Inside, he found a series of documents, handwritten notes by Thomas. As Vincent read the first few lines, he realized he was looking at something incredibly dangerous. They were detailed records of financial transactions, names of influential people, politicians, and businessmen, all of it tied to the money laundering scheme Percy had mentioned. Vincent felt a chill run down his spine. Thomas had kept these documents as leverage, something he could use to protect himself from Isaiah or anyone else who might want him dead. But now, those papers were in Vincent's hands, and that put him directly in the crosshairs of the same people who had threatened his brother. With the documents in hand, Vincent knew he had two options: hand everything over to Percy and trust that the law would do its job, or use the information as leverage, just as Thomas had intended. But as he considered the consequences, he realized that from this moment on, he and his family were more exposed than ever. The decision Vincent made now wouldn't just define Thomas's legacy, it would shape the future of his own family. The danger was far from over. The discovery of the documents in the metal box brought a new level of tension to Vincent's life. Thomas's notes revealed not only his involvement in the money laundering scheme, but also the depth of a corruption network that extended far beyond Isaias. These papers implicated influential people, politicians, businessmen, and public figures who could never be touched without devastating consequences. Vincent stared at the pages in front of him, his heart heavy. He knew he was holding something incredibly dangerous, something that could put his family at risk if it fell into the wrong hands. But what haunted him most was the realization that Thomas, even neck-deep in crime, had tried to leave himself a way out. It was as if he had known all along that this network would eventually destroy him. Catherine entered the room quietly and saw Vincent holding the documents. The look on his face said it all. The danger was far from over. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Vincent took a deep breath before answering. "Thomas, he left all of this," he said, pointing to the papers. "They're records, documents about the money laundering scheme." "He knew too much, Catherine. These papers show who was involved, who was behind it all, and now we're caught in the middle of it." Catherine sat beside him, her face pale as she leafed through the documents. Every name, every recorded transaction made the weight of the situation even more real. The list of powerful people who might come after them was long and terrifying. "We need to give this to Percy," Catherine said firmly. "He'll know what to do. These documents are dangerous, Vincent. We can't keep them here." Vincent looked at Catherine, knowing she was right, but part of him hesitated. If he handed everything over to Percy, he'd be placing all his trust in the system to protect his family. The power and influence of the people mentioned in those papers wouldn't be easily defeated. He knew there was a choice to be made, but no option felt safe. "What if they come after us, Catherine?" Vincent said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "These people, they have resources, connections. Thomas kept this because he knew it was his only chance of protecting himself, and now it's fallen into our hands." Catherine took Vincent's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll find a way to deal with this," she said, her eyes locked on his. "But we can't fight this alone. If we try to use these documents as leverage, we'll sink even deeper. Percy can help us do the right thing. He's the only person we can trust right now." Vincent nodded slowly. He knew Catherine was right, but the decision wasn't easy. The risk was enormous. Still, he couldn't let this web of lies and corruption destroy his family the way it had destroyed Thomas. With a sigh, Vincent picked up the phone and called Percy. The meeting was set for that same night, at a discreet location, far from any unwanted attention. When Percy heard about the documents, he immediately sounded concerned. "This changes everything, Vincent," Percy said over the phone. "We need to move quickly. But you need to know that by handing this over, you'll be stirring up some very powerful people. I'll make sure you and your family are protected. Just don't do anything until we meet." Vincent hung up the phone, the weight of the decisions still heavy on his shoulders. He and Catherine prepared to leave, arranging for a trusted neighbor to watch the children. The tension in the air was palpable, as if fate itself was waiting in suspense for the next move. When they arrived at the meeting point, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Percy was already waiting with two of his most trusted agents. The setting was dark, with the only light coming from a distant street lamp. Vincent stepped out of the car, feeling the cold night air seep into his bones, while Catherine followed close behind. "Do you have the documents?" Percy asked directly. Vincent nodded and handed over the metal box to Percy, who opened it and began skimming through the papers. His expression grew more serious with each page he read. When he finally closed the box, he looked at Vincent with a mix of concern and urgency. "This is explosive," Percy said, his voice grave. "If these documents come to light, they'll bring down a lot of people. But Vincent, you need to understand one thing. The people mentioned here won't let that happen without a fight. I'll turn this over to the right authorities, but you and your family will need protection. I'll make sure you're under constant surveillance, but don't think you'll be completely safe until this is over." Vincent already knew what was coming. He exchanged a look with Catherine, and she nodded silently. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, and whatever happened next, they would face it together. Percy signaled for his men to get ready. "I'm taking this straight to a special division that investigates high-level financial crimes," Percy said. "But until everything is processed, you need to stay out of sight. This could take days, weeks, maybe months. I know it's not what you want to hear, but it's the only way to keep you safe." Vincent thanked him, but the knot in his stomach didn't ease. The threat felt even bigger now, more real. He knew they had made the right decision, but the fear of something happening to his family gnawed at him. As Percy and his agents left with the documents, Vincent and Catherine returned to their car, the silence between them heavy with emotion. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. They were now up against forces far greater than Isaiah's. The days that followed were filled with constant vigilance and unease. Percy had managed to place Vincent and his family under protection, but the fear that something could spiral out of control was very real. The nights were long and restless, with Vincent repeatedly getting up to check the doors, the kids' rooms, and for any signs of danger lurking nearby. Catherine did her best to stay calm and maintain a sense of normalcy for Reuben, Gary, and Christina, but even the children could sense that something was wrong. Reuben, in particular, began asking increasingly difficult questions. He knew something was happening, and although Vincent tried to shield him from the full truth, he knew his son was sharp enough to realize that the danger was closer than ever. Percy kept in constant contact with Vincent, updating him on the progress of the investigation. Thomas's documents were key pieces in a much larger operation that was now gaining momentum. Powerful names were being investigated, and the corruption network was beginning to unravel. But as the operation advanced, so did the threat to Vincent's family. One afternoon, while Vincent and Catherine tried to enjoy a rare moment of peace in their backyard, Vincent's phone rang. It was Percy, and his voice sounded tense. "Vincent, I need you to leave the house right now. We've just received intel that people connected to the scheme know you're involved. We can't wait any longer. We're moving you to a safe location. Now." Panic washed over Vincent. He looked at Catherine, who could already tell from his expression that something terrible was happening. They were out of time. The danger had finally caught up to them. Without hesitation, Vincent and Catherine rushed inside, gathering the children quickly. Reuben seemed to understand what was going on, his face serious as he helped his younger siblings get ready. Within minutes, they were prepared to leave, but deep down, Vincent knew this escape was only temporary. When Percy's car arrived, Vincent felt the weight of an inescapable reality. As long as Thomas's legacy remained, as long as the secrets he had kept continued to be uncovered, the danger would never truly be far behind. The escape that afternoon was swift, with no time for goodbyes or explanations. Vincent, Catherine, and the children were taken to a safe, isolated location under constant surveillance. Percy had assured them that this would be a temporary refuge until the entire operation was completed, but Vincent knew that nothing felt temporary anymore. The threat looming over them was real and persistent. The following weeks passed slowly, with an almost unbearable tension. Though the refuge was safe, it was a constant reminder that they were being hunted. Reuben, ever observant, tried to stay strong for his siblings, but Vincent could see the fear growing in his son's eyes. Gary and Christina, still too young to grasp the gravity of the situation, simply followed the rhythm of the days, guided by the routine Catherine tried to maintain. Percy's updates were frequent. The operation was progressing, and more names were being arrested, but the corruption network was vast. Each new step in the investigation revealed deeper layers of a scheme that extended far beyond Isaiah's. Even so, the threats continued, and Percy knew that the exposure of Thomas's documents had created more enemies than Vincent could imagine. One night, as Vincent and Catherine prepared for another evening of quiet vigilance, the phone rang. It was Percy again, but this time, there was a different tone in his voice. There was relief. "Vincent, "We just arrested the last person who was after you. The arrests have been made, the leaders are behind bars, and the network has been dismantled. You can go home." Vincent felt the weight of months of fear, tension, and uncertainty begin to lift. Catherine, hearing the conversation, covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. The nightmare they had lived through for so long finally seemed to be over. "So? It's over?" Vincent asked, almost not believing it. "Yes," Percy replied. "You're safe now, and this time, I guarantee it." Even with Percy's assurance, Vincent knew that the scars from this experience would remain. Thomas had died, a victim of his own choices and a world he couldn't control. The guilt over his brother's death was still a burden Vincent would carry. But now there was room to move forward. The cycle of fear and violence that had threatened to destroy his family was finally over. In the days that followed their return, Vincent and Catherine began rebuilding their lives. They returned to a house that, although physically the same, no longer carried the weight of the secrets that had once almost destroyed them. They decided to sell the old house, the one where so many moments of fear and loss had occurred, and start fresh in a new place, one unmarked by the shadows of the past. Reuben, Gary, and Christina slowly began to smile again. The emotional scars were still there, but with time, they began to heal. Vincent realized that the greatest legacy he could leave his children wouldn't be a story of secrets and tragedies, but one of resilience and family unity. On the day of the move, Vincent and Catherine stood in front of their new home, a place that symbolized a new beginning, far from the ghosts of the past. Catherine held Reuben and Christina's hands, while Vincent held Gary's. They knew the journey had been long and painful, but now, finally, they felt they could breathe again. Before entering the house, Vincent took one last look around. The memories of Thomas still weighed on his mind, but now they were just that, memories. He knew, deep down, that he had done everything he could to save his brother. Thomas had made his choices, but Vincent and Catherine had chosen to fight for their family, and they had won. As the door closed behind them, Vincent knew that this chapter of their lives had finally come to an end. The cycle of secrets, fears, and persecution was over. Now they could begin anew, free from the past.